My name is Lucy Morgan. I'm 28 years old, and the Christmas I discovered my own family had planned to publicly humiliate me was also the Christmas I decided to give them a gift they'd never forget, one wrapped in legal documents and cold, hard truth. You won't believe what happened next, because what started as overheard whispers turned into the most satisfying moment of my entire life. I found out they wanted to embarrass me on Christmas, so I gave them a gift they'll regret forever. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Growing up, I was always the one who didn't quite fit the family mold. Too quiet for their loud dinners, too thoughtful for their quick judgment, too sensitive for their sharp humor. My older sister Amanda was the golden child, confident and charismatic, always surrounded by admirers and approval. My younger brother Kyle was the charming troublemaker who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. And then there was me, Lucy, the middle child who tried too hard to please everyone and somehow still ended up being the punchline of every family joke. I learned early on that keeping my head down and my mouth shut was the easiest way to avoid becoming the center of unwanted attention. But this particular year felt different somehow, heavier, like there was an invisible weight pressing down on my chest every time my phone buzzed with a family group chat message. My mother, Patricia, had been unusually insistent about me coming to Christmas dinner, texting me multiple times a day with reminders and guilt trips about family traditions and how much everyone missed me. Something about her tone felt off, too sweet, too forced, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed. Little did I know that my gut instinct was trying to warn me about something I couldn't yet see, something that would change everything I thought I knew about the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Living as the family outsider isn't something that happens overnight. It's a slow erosion of self-worth that starts with small comments and builds into a lifetime of feeling like you're watching your own life from behind soundproof glass. For me, it began in childhood with forgotten school events my parents somehow never made time for, while Amanda's soccer games and Kyle's band concerts were circled in red on the family calendar. It continued through my teenage years when my accomplishments were met with distracted nods, while my siblings' achievements were celebrated with expensive dinners and Facebook posts my mother would share dozens of times. By the time I reached adulthood, I'd become so accustomed to being the afterthought that I'd started to believe I deserved exactly the amount of attention they gave, which was just enough to keep me around, but never enough to make me feel truly wanted. The pattern was always the same. They'd invite me to family gatherings, I'd show up with a smile and a contribution nobody asked for, and I'd spend the evening being talked over, interrupted, or completely ignored while they laughed at inside jokes I was never included in creating. My sister Amanda would make subtle digs about my career choice as a librarian, calling it cute and safe compared to her high-powered marketing job. My brother Kyle would mock my wardrobe, my car, my apartment, always with that teasing tone that made it impossible to call him out without looking like I couldn't take a joke. My parents would laugh along, never once stepping in to defend me, never once acknowledging that their constant dismissal was slowly killing something essential inside me. But I kept showing up because that's what you do when you're raised to believe that blood is thicker than water, that family is everything, that somehow your silence and sacrifice will eventually earn you the love and respect you've been chasing your entire life. I convinced myself that maybe next Christmas would be different, maybe next Thanksgiving they'd finally see me, maybe next birthday they'd remember without needing a Facebook reminder. What I didn't realize was that I was playing a game where the rules were designed to keep me losing, and the only way to win was to stop playing altogether. But that revelation was still a few devastating days away from revealing itself. The moment I became the overlooked one wasn't marked on any calendar, but if I had to pinpoint it, I'd say it started the day my sister Amanda brought home her first boyfriend, and my mother spent 3 hours preparing a special dinner while I sat at the kitchen table doing homework that nobody would ever ask about. I was 12 years old, wearing a new dress I'd bought with my babysitting money, hoping someone would notice, but Amanda's laughter filled every corner of the house, and I became invisible furniture. From that day forward, I learned that my role in this family was to occupy space without requiring acknowledgement, to contribute without expecting appreciation, to exist in the margins of their spotlight. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you're subscribed because what comes next is absolutely insane. And leave a like if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. I spent my 20s perfecting the art of being useful without being seen, showing up early to help set up for family parties, staying late to clean up the mess, remembering everyone's birthdays when they forgot mine, sending thoughtful gifts that were opened with distracted thank yous, while Amanda's generic gift cards were praised as so practical and thoughtful. I became the family's emotional support system, the one my mother would call when she needed someone to listen to her complain about Amanda's demanding schedule or Kyle's irresponsible spending, but never the one she'd call to celebrate good news or share exciting plans. My father, Robert, would occasionally pat my shoulder and say things like, "You're such a good girl, Lucy," in that tone people use when they're acknowledging a well-behaved pet rather than a human being with needs and feelings. The pattern became so ingrained that I started to internalize it as truth. Maybe I really was less interesting, less accomplished, less worthy of attention than my siblings. Maybe my quiet personality and modest lifestyle genuinely didn't deserve the same celebration as Amanda's promotions and Kyle's adventure. I accepted my position as the family's afterthought so completely that when they'd make plans without including me and then act surprised when I felt hurt, I'd apologize for being sensitive. I'd laugh along when they teased me about my boring life, my safe choices, my predictable nature. I became complicit in my own diminishment because somewhere along the way, I'd started to believe that being loved conditionally was better than not being loved at all. When my mother called me 3 weeks before Christmas instead of just texting in the family group chat, I knew something was different. Patricia Morgan didn't make phone calls unless she wanted something or needed to deliver information she couldn't risk having in writing. Her voice had that artificially cheerful quality, like a customer service representative reading from a script, as she told me how much everyone was looking forward to seeing me this year, and how it wouldn't be Christmas without the whole family together. The words were right, but the melody was wrong, like a song played in the correct key but with all the emotional beats in the wrong place. I found myself gripping my phone tighter, my stomach twisting with an anxiety I couldn't quite name, as she emphasized multiple times how important it was that I didn't miss this year's celebration. In the days that followed, the invitations kept coming. Texts from Amanda saying she couldn't wait to catch up, messages from Kyle joking about how he'd saved me a seat at the kids' table, even though we were all adults now. Even my father sent a rare email with the subject line, "Christmas plans," that felt formal and strategic rather than warm and familial. Each message felt like a breadcrumb leading me towards something I couldn't see yet, and my instincts were screaming at me to pay attention, to question why this year felt so different from all the others, when they'd barely noticed whether I showed up or not. But I did what I always did. I pushed down the discomfort, told myself I was being paranoid, and confirmed my attendance because rejecting their invitations would require an explanation I didn't have the courage to voice. The week before Christmas, I went shopping for gifts with the same careful consideration I always brought to the task: a cashmere scarf in Amanda's favorite color, a limited edition vinyl record Kyle had mentioned wanting 6 months ago in a conversation nobody else remembered, a book about vintage cars for my father, and an expensive cooking gadget for my mother that I knew she'd use once and then forget about. As I wrapped each present with meticulous care, adding personalized cards with heartfelt messages they probably wouldn't read, that uncomfortable feeling in my chest grew stronger, like my body was trying to warn me about something my mind refused to acknowledge. But still, I packed everything carefully into gift bags, planned my outfit, and told myself that maybe this year would be different. Maybe this would be the Christmas where they finally saw me, never imagining that they were planning to see me in a way I'd never forget. 2 days before Christmas, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a homemade gingerbread house I'd spent an entire weekend creating, complete with hand-piped icing details and a roof made of carefully placed candy canes that I'd arranged with tweezers because I wanted everything to be perfect. My mother had texted me earlier saying she was out running errands, so I let myself in with the key I'd had since high school, planning to leave the gingerbread house on the kitchen counter with a cheerful note. The house was quiet, or so I thought, until I heard voices coming from the den. Amanda's distinctive laugh, Kyle's deeper chuckle, and my mother's voice carrying that conspiratorial tone she used when she was sharing gossip she knew she shouldn't be spreading. I should have called out, should have announced my presence, but something in the quality of their laughter made me freeze in the hallway, my hand still gripping the gingerbread house, my heart already starting to pound with a dread I couldn't explain. Then I heard my name, spoken in that mocking tone Amanda had perfected over 30 years of sibling rivalry, and I found myself moving closer to the partially open door, pressing myself against the wall like a spy in my own childhood home. What I heard in the next 60 seconds shattered every remaining illusion I'd been clinging to about what family was supposed to mean. "So, we're still doing the This Is Your Life Lucy presentation at Christmas dinner, right?" Amanda was saying, her voice bright with malicious excitement. "I've got the slideshow ready. Every awkward photo, every embarrassing moment, every cringeworthy thing she's ever done." Kyle found that video from her high school talent show where she forgot the words to her song and just stood there crying. "It's going to be hilarious." My mother's response was even worse than my sister's cruelty. She laughed, actually laughed, and said something that made my blood run cold. She'll probably cry, but honestly, maybe it'll toughen her up a bit. She's been so sensitive her whole life. Besides, everyone needs to learn to laugh at themselves, right? I stood there in that hallway, holding a gingerbread house I'd made with love for people who were planning to humiliate me for entertainment, and felt something fundamental break inside my chest. The gingerbread house slipped from my hands and hit the hardwood floor with a crash that echoed through the entire house, candy canes and icing fragments scattering across the entryway like the shattered pieces of my trust. The voices in the den went silent immediately, and I heard footsteps rushing toward me, but I was already backing toward the front door, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall in front of them. Amanda appeared first, her face cycling through surprise, guilt, and then that familiar dismissive expression she always wore when she got caught doing something. "Lucy, it's supposed to be funny, it's not a big deal," she started, but I held up my hand to stop her, my voice coming out steadier than I expected considering my entire world had just collapsed. "How long?" I asked, looking past Amanda to where my mother and Kyle had emerged from the den, both of them wearing expressions that told me this wasn't a spontaneous idea. This was planned, rehearsed, agreed upon by the entire family while I'd been carefully selecting their Christmas gifts. "How long have you been planning this?" My mother had the audacity to look defensive, crossing her arms and saying, "Oh, Lucy, don't be so dramatic. It's just a little fun, family tradition, nothing mean-spirited about it." But I could see it in their faces. The three of them had spent hours, maybe weeks, curating my most painful moments into a performance designed to make them laugh and make me small. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, because what I did next changed everything, and you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. I left without another word, stepping over the ruins of the gingerbread house I'd made with such care, walking to my car while Amanda called after me with increasingly desperate explanations that all sounded like variations of "learn to take a joke." I drove home in a fog of shock and hurt so profound I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see through my tears, couldn't catch my breath, couldn't reconcile the family I desperately wanted to believe in with the reality of people who would orchestrate my public humiliation and call it entertainment. My first impulse was to call and cancel, to simply not show up, to disappear from their lives the way I'd always felt invisible anyway. But as I sat in my parked car outside my apartment, something shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it transformed into something colder, sharper, more calculating. If they wanted to give me a show, I would give them one they'd never forget. I didn't answer their calls, not Amanda's increasingly frantic voicemails that evolved from defensive justifications to half-hearted apologies, not Kyle's text messages trying to play the whole thing off as a misunderstanding, not even my mother's carefully worded texts that managed to avoid any actual acknowledgement of wrongdoing while suggesting I was overreacting to a harmless family joke. The silence I maintained wasn't passive, it was deliberate, strategic, a weapon I'd never thought to use before because I'd always been so desperate to maintain connection that I'd accept crumbs of affection disguised as love. But something had fundamentally shifted in me during that drive home from my parents' house. I'd stopped caring whether they loved me and started caring whether I respected myself. My phone buzzed constantly for the first 24 hours, the family group chat exploding with messages that ranged from confused, "Lucy, where did you go?" to annoyed, "Seriously, this is ridiculous," to vaguely threatening, "You're really going to ruin Christmas over this?" What fascinated me was that none of them, not one single message from any family member, actually apologized for planning to humiliate me. Instead, they apologized for me finding out about it, for me taking it the wrong way, for my inability to see the humor in their cruelty. They were sorry I was upset, but not sorry for the actions that caused the upset. And that distinction told me everything I needed to know about how little they actually valued me as a person. By the second day, the messages took on a different tone. My mother sent a long text about how I was tearing the family apart and making Christmas awkward for everyone, as if I was the problem rather than the family members who'd spent weeks preparing a public roast of my most vulnerable moment. Amanda actually had the audacity to say I was being selfish by withdrawing, that I owed it to the family to show up and be a good sport. But I didn't respond to any of it. I let my silence speak for itself, let them sit in the discomfort of not knowing what I was thinking, planning, feeling. For the first time in my life, I wasn't rushing to smooth things over, to make them feel better about hurting me, to reassure them that everything was fine when it absolutely wasn't. I spent those 2 days before Christmas doing something I should have done years ago. I went through every document, every piece of paperwork, every financial record related to my family that I'd stored in file boxes and forgotten about. Initially, I was just looking for a distraction, something to occupy my mind instead of replaying that overheard conversation on an endless loop. But what I found was so much more than distraction. It was ammunition I didn't even know I possessed. Buried in a folder labeled Family Business 2018 was a contract I'd completely forgotten about, signed during a desperate period when my parents' small real estate investment company was struggling and they needed someone to co-sign on a significant property loan. The memory came flooding back as I read through the pages. I'd been 23 years old, freshly graduated from college, and my father had called me with that rare warmth in his voice, telling me how proud he was, how responsible I'd always been, how they needed my excellent credit score to help secure a loan for a property that would set the family up for generations. I'd signed without really reading the fine print, trusting that my parents wouldn't put me in a financially vulnerable position, believing that this was finally my chance to prove my worth to them. The loan had been paid off years ago, or so I thought. But as I dug deeper into the paperwork, I discovered something that made my hands shake with a mixture of rage and vindication. The property they'd purchased with that loan, a small commercial building they rented out to various businesses, was still partially in my name. Not only that, but according to the original contract terms I'd never bothered to read carefully, I was entitled to 20% of all rental income from that property in perpetuity as compensation for the risk I'd taken as a co-signer. 20% of rental income I'd never received, never been told about, never even knew I was owed. I pulled up my laptop and started calculating. The building had been consistently rented for 7 years, and if my math was correct, my family owed me somewhere in the vicinity of $48,000 in back payment. But more importantly, the contract stipulated that any co-signer had the right to demand full financial audits, require mediation for disputes, or even force the sale of the property if payments weren't being honored. I sat there in my apartment, surrounded by scattered documents, and felt something I'd never associated with my family before: power. I spent the entire next morning on the phone with a lawyer named Jennifer Chen, a sharp-minded contract attorney I found through a legal referral service. And with every minute of our conversation, I felt layers of victimhood peeling away to reveal something I'd never allowed myself to be: someone who refused to be taken advantage of anymore. Jennifer reviewed the documents I'd scanned and emailed to her, and her assessment was even better than I'd hoped. "Lucy, this is ironclad," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of professional excitement and personal outrage. "Not only are you entitled to 7 years of back payments with interest, but they've been in breach of contract this entire time. You have every legal right to demand an immediate audit of all finances related to this property, and if they can't produce the funds owed to you, you can force a sale." But it wasn't just about the money, though $48,000 would certainly change my financial situation in significant ways. It was about the pattern of exploitation that extended far beyond this one contract. As Jennifer and I talked, I started remembering other instances where my family had used me without compensation or acknowledgement. The summer I'd spent managing their rental properties while they vacationed in Europe, work they'd promised to make up to me, but never did. The countless hours I'd spent doing their bookkeeping, filing their taxes, organizing their financial documents because I was so good with numbers and detail. The emotional labor of always being available, always being helpful, always being the reliable one they could count on, while simultaneously being the one they felt comfortable mocking and dismissing. If you're watching this and realizing you've been undervalued by your own family, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, because what happens next is the moment everything shifted. I'd spent my entire life believing that my worth in this family was determined by how useful I could, how little trouble I caused, how readily I accepted whatever scraps of affection they threw my way. But sitting there with Jennifer on speakerphone, looking at contracts that proved my family had been financially benefiting from me while treating me as their personal joke, I finally understood something crucial. I had never been powerless. I had been complicit in my own marginalization by never demanding the respect, acknowledgement, and compensation I deserved. They'd taken advantage of me not because I was weak, but because I'd never shown them there would be consequences for treating me as less than I was worth. That realization didn't feel triumphant or victorious. It felt like waking up from a decades-long sleep and discovering I'd been dreaming someone else's version of reality. Jennifer laid out my options with the kind of clinical precision I needed to hear. I could send a demand letter requesting immediate payment of all back compensation. I could file a formal complaint and pursue legal action. Or I could leverage this information to negotiate a settlement that included both financial restitution and a formal severance of my involvement in any family business matters. "What do you want the outcome to be?" she asked me, and I realized nobody had asked me what I wanted in longer than I could remember. My family had always told me what to do, how to feel, what role to play, but they'd never once asked what I actually needed or desired for my own life. "I want them to understand that I'm not a joke," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "I want them to know that there are consequences for treating people badly, even if those people have spent their whole lives accepting that treatment. I want my money, yes, but more than that, I want my dignity back." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that crystallized everything I was feeling. "Lucy, dignity isn't something they can give back to you because they never took it. You gave it away by tolerating their behavior. What you're doing now isn't revenge. It's reclamation. You're taking back what was always yours." We spent the next 3 hours crafting a comprehensive legal demand that went beyond just the rental income issue. Jennifer helped me document every instance where I'd provided unpaid labor for family businesses, every promise they'd made and broken, every financial commitment they'd failed to honor. The final letter was 14 pages long, backed by contracts, emails, text messages, and financial records that painted an undeniable picture of a family that had systematically exploited their daughter while claiming to love her. The demand was simple: immediate payment of all owed compensation totaling approximately $63,000 when everything was calculated, a formal release from all future business obligations, and a written acknowledgement of the breach of contract. Jennifer would send the letter via certified mail to arrive on Christmas Eve, ensuring they'd receive it right before their planned dinner, where they'd intended to make me the entertainment. I wasn't going to show up and cry or argue or defend myself. I was going to let legal documents do the talking, while I spent Christmas somewhere I'd never been before, at peace. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of crisp winter clarity that made everything feel sharp and defined, and I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years despite, or perhaps because of, the chaos I knew was about to unfold at my parents' house. Jennifer had confirmed via text that the certified letters had been delivered at 10:47 a.m., which meant my family had received their Christmas presents right around the time my mother would have been preparing her famous honey-glazed ham and setting out the good china she only used for holidays. I imagined my father signing for the thick envelope, probably assuming it was a late Christmas card from a distant relative, opening it casually while sipping his morning coffee. And then the moment of recognition when he saw the law firm's letterhead and realized what he was reading. According to the delivery confirmation, there were actually 4 separate envelopes, one addressed to my parents jointly, one to Amanda, one to Kyle, and a 4th to the Family Business LLC. Jennifer had suggested making it impossible for them to hide the information from each other, ensuring that everyone would know simultaneously that their free ride on Lucy's doormat days was officially over. Each letter was customized to the recipient, detailing specific instances where they'd personally benefited from my unpaid labor or broken promises, but all of them ended with the same bottom line: full payment within 30 days or face legal action including property seizure, public court filings, and formal breach of contract lawsuits that would become part of the public record. My phone started ringing at 11:15 a.m., my father's number lighting up my screen with an urgency I'd never seen from him before. I let it go to voicemail. Then my mother called, then Amanda, then Kyle, then my father again, then all of them in rapid succession like they'd coordinated an attack strategy. I turned my phone to silent, made myself a cup of coffee, and settled onto my couch with a book I'd been meaning to read for months, finally able to focus on the words because I wasn't spending my mental energy wondering why my family didn't love me. The answer had become irrelevant. What mattered now was that I loved myself enough to stop accepting their version of love as the only option available to me. The voicemails, when I finally listened to them hours later, were a masterclass in the stages of manipulation, denial, anger, bargaining, and finally, desperate attempts at guilt. My father's first message was pure confusion. "Lucy, I don't understand what this legal letter is about. There must be some mistake. Call me immediately so we can clear this up." By his third message, the confusion had transformed into indignation. "This is completely inappropriate. You don't send legal threats to your own family on Christmas. Whatever you think we owe you, we can discuss it like adults, not through lawyers." But it was his final message, the one he left at 3:47 p.m., that revealed the truth beneath all his bluster. "Lucy, please. The letter says you can force us to sell the property. That building is our retirement plan. You can't do this to your mother and me." Amanda's messages were characteristically self-centered, starting with outrage that I would embarrass the family like this, and evolving into accusations that I was ruining Christmas for everyone and being vindictive over a stupid joke. What she never said, what none of them said in those initial messages, was anything resembling an actual apology for planning to humiliate me or for 7 years of withheld payment. Kyle's approach was different. He tried the buddy route, leaving messages that suggested we were co-conspirators against our uptight parent. Luce, come on, this is crazy. Yeah, mom and dad should have paid you, but lawyers? Really? Let's just talk this out over a beer like normal people. He still didn't understand that I wasn't interested in being his drinking buddy or anyone's punchline anymore. But it was my mother's messages that were the most telling, cycling through every manipulation technique she'd perfected over 30 years of parenthood. First came the wounded martyr. I don't understand how I raised a daughter who would do something so cruel to her own mother on Christmas. Then the guilt trip. Your grandmother is supposed to come to dinner, and now I have to explain why you're not here and why we received legal threats instead of presents from our own child. And finally, the one that would have broken me a week ago, but now just made me sad for the woman who thought emotional blackmail was the same thing as love. If you go through with this, Lucy, you're choosing money over family. I hope you can live with that decision. What she didn't understand was that they'd chosen money over me years ago when they decided to keep my rightful payments and treat me like I wasn't worth basic honesty or respect. I was just finally choosing myself. Christmas Day arrived without the usual knot of anxiety in my stomach, without the familiar dread of walking into a room where I'd spend hours trying to make myself small enough to avoid ridicule, but visible enough to be included. Instead, I woke up in my quiet apartment, made myself breakfast without rushing, and did something I'd never done before on Christmas. I considered what I actually wanted to do with the day rather than what was expected of me. I'd received 47 text messages overnight, the family group chat exploding with messages that ranged from my aunt asking, "What's going on with Lucy?" to my cousin saying she'd heard I was suing the family, to my grandmother's simple, heartbreaking message, "I miss you, sweetheart. Please come to dinner." I felt a pang of guilt about my grandmother, the one family member who'd always treated me with genuine kindness, but I also knew that showing up to that dinner would send a message I couldn't afford to send, that legal documents and boundaries were negotiable if they just applied enough emotional pressure. So instead, I got dressed, drove to the nicest restaurant in town that was open on Christmas, and had a peaceful meal by myself while reading my book and occasionally glancing at my phone to watch the family chaos unfold in real time. My mother posted a photo on Facebook of the dinner table with a pointed caption about family members who choose to be absent on the most important day of the year, and I felt absolutely nothing. No shame, no regret, no desperate urge to explain myself or defend my choices. What I felt instead was something completely foreign and utterly liberating. I felt free from the exhausting performance of pretending their jokes didn't hurt, free from the constant calculation of how to be helpful enough to earn love, but not so visible that I became a target, free from the soul-crushing belief that I somehow deserved to be treated as less than I was worth. I responded to my grandmother separately, sending her a long message explaining that I loved her, but needed to establish boundaries with family members who'd been treating me poorly, promising to visit her privately after the holidays. To everyone else, I sent one simple group message: "I'll be in touch through my attorney. Merry Christmas." Then I muted the entire conversation and ordered dessert. The days following Christmas brought exactly what Jennifer had predicted, a flurry of activity as my family scrambled between denial, rage, and finally, reluctant negotiation. My father tried to argue that the contract was invalid because I'd been too young to understand what I was signing, which Jennifer quickly shut down with proof that I was 23 and legally capable of entering contracts. Amanda attempted to convince other family members that I was being greedy and vindictive, but several cousins actually reached out privately to tell me they'd had similar experiences of being used and dismissed by the family, thanking me for finally standing up. Kyle went silent completely after Jennifer sent a follow-up letter detailing the specific bookkeeping work I'd done for his failed business venture that he'd never paid me for. By New Year's Eve, my parents' lawyer contacted Jennifer to discuss settlement, and I knew I'd won, not because they were going to pay me what they owed, though that was certainly satisfying, but because I'd proven to myself that I was worth fighting for. The final settlement included full payment of the $63,000, plus an additional $20,000 to cover my legal fees and what Jennifer called pain and suffering, my complete release from any family business obligation, and a formal written acknowledgement that they'd breached multiple contractual agreements. What it didn't include was an apology, and I was okay with that, because I'd stopped needing their validation the moment I started validating myself. Looking back now, I can honestly say that discovering my family's plan to humiliate me on Christmas was the greatest gift they ever gave me, even though they didn't mean it that way. It forced me to see clearly what I'd been avoiding for decades, that love isn't about accepting whatever treatment people offer and being grateful for scraps of affection between servings of cruelty. Real love requires respect, honesty, reciprocity, and the basic understanding that someone's worth isn't determined by how useful they are or how quietly they tolerate mistreatment. I don't know if my family and I will ever have a real relationship, and honestly, I'm not sure I want one anymore. What I do know is that I'll never again mistake being needed for being valued or confuse showing up for being seen. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is give yourself the gift of choosing yourself, even when, especially when, nobody else will. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally will be the ones who make you feel like you have to earn every scrap of their affection. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop trying to earn what should have been freely given in the first place. If you're watching this and you've been that person in your family, the one who's always accommodating, always forgiving, always accepting less than you deserve because you're terrified of being alone, I need you to hear this. You are not responsible for managing other people's cruelty. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep people warm who wouldn't cross the street to get you a glass of water. And you are absolutely, unequivocally allowed to choose yourself, even when it disappoints everyone else. After hearing my story, I want you to ask yourself, what would you have done in my place? Would you have sent those legal documents? Or would you have shown up to that dinner and tried to laugh along with people who were laughing at you? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? Drop your answer in the comments below because I genuinely want to know. Am I the villain in this story for using legal action against my own family? Or was I finally standing up for myself after a lifetime of being walked on? There's no right answer, but I'd love to hear your perspective and your own experiences with family boundaries and betrayal.